Hello and welcome everybody who's here in person and online. I'm Evelyn Jago. I'm the vice principal here at Innis College, and I'm so happy to welcome you to this evening's event, which was postponed. It was supposed to be back in October, and I think it's really fitting to have it now in January because it's a very kind of sunny, hot feeling of a book. So I think we're gonna enjoy that feeling on this winter evening. And Katie, I wanted to say to you, what a beautiful cover. It's such a cool looking book. Before we begin, I'd like to read the land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and celebrate on this land. I will not be presenting Katie. Charlotte's going to do that, so I'm going to present Charlotte. So Charlotte Gill was born in London and raised in the United States and Canada. And she is the author of Eating Dirt, a national bestseller that won the BC National Award for Canadian Nonfiction. It's a memoir about tree planting. This title was also a finalist for the Hilary Weston Writers' Trust Prize and the RBC Taylor Prize. Her previous book, Lady Killer, a book of short stories, was a Governor General's Award nominee. Her fiction and narrative nonfiction have appeared in Vogue, Hazlitt, The Walrus, and many other newspapers and magazines. Gill is the Rogers Communications Chair in Literary Journalism at the Banff Centre, and she is also faculty in the MFA program in Creative Nonfiction at the University of King's College in Halifax. Her next book, which we're all eagerly waiting for, Almost Brown, is forthcoming in June from Penguin Random House. She lives on the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, Canada. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte, who is here. There she is. And take it away, Charlotte. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you all. Thank you all for coming. I'm joining virtually today. I wish I could be there. I'm speaking to you from Powell River, British Columbia, also known as Kathat, within the ancestral territory of the Tla'amin Nation. But I can promise you there is a very specific reason why I am the moderator for tonight's event, and it's because Katie and I go way back. We share an alma mater, of course, but we were also fellow students together at Innis, the University of Toronto, way back when. We lived together for a little while in a student house just a few doors down from Innis College on Sussex Avenue. We had an overlap of about a year during our undergrad careers, and in that time, I got to know Katie as just a brilliant, smart, and very funny person, and I know you're going to discover the same thing tonight in the next hour or so. Katie writes fiction and teaches music in Kamloops, BC, on the traditional unceded territory of the Secwepemc people. Her short stories have been published in Event Magazine, Prairie Fire, the Antigonish Review, the Thames Review, the Quarantine Review, and elsewhere. She was first runner-up in UBCO's 2019 short story contest, and her story Poisoned Apple was chosen as Pick of the Week by Long-Form Fiction. Katie holds a BA in English Literature from the University of Toronto. Her daughters, Olivia and Heather Saya, share her passion for nature and outdoor recreation. Katie loves to cycle, hike, and cross-country ski with her husband, Will Stinson, and they're creating a remote home on Cortez Island in Desolation Sound. Please welcome Katie Welch.
Hello, and thank you for that introduction, Charlotte. It's a great honor and a distinct pleasure to introduce Mad Honey at Innis College. Many thanks to Principal Charlie Kyle and Ennis Blentic, who extended the original invitation, and to Acting Principal Karen Reed and Vice Principal Evelyn Jago for getting behind the idea and hosting tonight. Thank you to Shayla Anderson for organizing the event not once but twice. I was supposed to be here in October. And of course to Charlotte Gill for moderating this evening. Thank you to my publisher, Balzac & Wynne, for always believing in the book and doing such an amazing job with it. And to you guys for coming out tonight, thank you so much, both here and everyone who's here on video. And thank you also to my brother Tim and sister Maureen, without whose friendship I wouldn't be here tonight. And my brother's in the audience tonight, so. Next, a few brief remarks on what introducing Mad Honey at Innis means to me. I had the good fortune to attend high school in the 1980s, when the counterculturists of the 1960s had gotten married, had kids, gone to teachers' college, and were quietly teaching their revolutionary radical ideas to the next generation. My school in Ottawa, Fisher Park, was a hotbed of enthusiastic instructors, and they were also very kind and perceptive. And I found myself at 16 years old in the guidance counselor's office. And at that time, I'd never considered post-secondary education. It just seemed beyond my reach in so many ways. And I told this guidance counselor what was happening at my house. And she said, well, you can't stay there. And I said, I know. And she said, well, the answer's right in front of you. You just need to win full scholarships to out-of-town universities. And so that was the new goal. And she handed me a stack of pamphlets. So from those pamphlets, Innis College at the University of Toronto was my first choice for many, many reasons. Among them, it was secular, it was intimate and not too intimidating, and it was diverse. The residents I most wanted to be a part of, Tattle Creek Cooperative Housing, chose students from various academic and cultural backgrounds. So I wrote a letter as part of an admissions process and applied and crossed my fingers and waited. And the day I got my acceptance letter to Innis College and Tattle Creek was 1987, so it was Hogwarts 10 years before Hogwarts. I was ecstatic. I was incredibly happy. And I was literally dropped off this way, I think, on the front lawn of 10 Sussex Avenue a few months later. And I lived there throughout my undergraduate degree. The University of Toronto and Innis College were like intellectual Disneyland for me. My courses and instructors surpassed my wildest dreams. And Mad Honey is the culmination of the educational experience I had here. It took me a long way around to get here, but here I am. So it's phenomenal, actually, to be standing here tonight. So I wrote a book about a man who became a bee colony. Mad Honey opens with Beck Wise in a cabin. He knows only that he has been bees, and he walks confused. He's very confused to be back in his human form, and he walks to his girlfriend Melissa Makepeace's house at a farm nearby. And I'm going to read a short scene from the book, from that moment, where Beck has walked back after a 3-month unexplained absence, and he's at the farm. Do you remember when I first told you about the waggle dance? He asked. It was a strange question, but she remembered. She accessed the memory hole like the plot of a favorite movie. It was another summer night, a starry one. Holding hands, they'd gone for a walk along the gravel road, heading south, away from Lanark, warm wind like tender fingers brushing their skin. An owl had swooped over fields besides the road, sound of its soft hoot, glimpse of its flat, menacing white face. A childish euphoria had engulfed Melissa, and impulsively she'd pulled him back close, hummed an invented waltz, and entreated him to dance. She'd worn a soft, pale green cotton dress, she remembered, he a hippie shirt and baggy hemp pants. In shadows, they could have been dressed for a formal event. Sandal-shod feet had crunched on a makeshift ballroom floor. Beck had gotten into it, taken up the melody, spun her around. The dance had ended with a passionate kiss. Honeybees dance, you know, Beck had said. Sure they do. You've never heard of the waggle dance? Waggle dance. Now I know you're fibbing. Well, I'm not. It's how the worker bees tell each other about juicy patches of nectar. They orient their bodies in relation to the sun. They point their hairy little butts however many degrees left or right of the sun's position a bee would need to turn herself to fly out and find a feast of flowers. That's not dancing. That's rotating. I'm not finished. The dancing bee waggles her hind section super fast and moves in a figure 8. The length of the dance is in direct proportion to how far the nectar mother lode is found. I've never heard of dancing bees. There are more things in heaven and hell that are dreamed of in your philosophy. Mine too. Now get this. Let's say it's been a couple of hours since the dancing bee has been to the flowers, but she still wants to tell everyone about it. She actually corrects the angle of her dance for the rotation of the earth. Melissa remembered the night she'd learned about bee dances. After their walk, they'd made love, half-dressed, her green dress bunched up around her waist, his hemp pants dangling around one ankle. Back in the present on the porch, she grunted and curled up tighter in a corner of the couch, drawing her knees to her chest, defending herself against Beck's dishonesty. You didn't believe me at first, Beck said. That's right, I didn't. What's your point? She snapped. If I tell you, will you keep it just between us? Where you were this summer is a secret? Her voice cracked on the last word. Humor me for a minute. He sat motionless, holding himself steady with his arms, as if a light breeze might topple him. Melissa exhaled hard and assented with a brief downward jerk of her head. Beck addressed the lawn. I woke up in the cabin the other day and I didn't know where I'd been. My brain felt foggy, like I had a bad hangover, and I had these snatches, impressions, and they were kind of terrifying, like when you wake up from a nightmare. And the whole nightmare was based on... Beck glanced at her and stopped talking. He swallowed with difficulty. My patience is blade thin right now, Melissa warned. On being a bee colony, he said in a rush, like I was inside a beehive and I was the whole colony. Thousands of workers, hundreds of drones. Go on, I'm listening. Her dinner curdled in her stomach. Beck spoke mechanically and miserably, like he was being forced at gunpoint to recite a story he hated. And larvae too, always cycling, older bees dying, larvae hatching, just like the cells in your body. I dreamed there was a voice in my head, a woman's voice, narrating everything I did. I can still hear her now. Beck shuddered. You woke up from a dream you were a beehive. No, I'm telling you, it feels like I was bees, a whole bee colony. Like all I did this summer was drink nectar, collect pollen, nurse the larvae, fan the hive, take care of my queen. I was bees. Thank you. Over here.
Katie, I'm unable to see. Oh, there we go. I've got another cam. Thank you. It's wonderful to see you again.
It's great to see you, Charlotte. Thank you.
That was a beautiful reading. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to start with your life because you have such an interesting creative existence. You're a writer and you teach music. Did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
I did always want to be a writer. I think my love for nature came before my love for writing, and that started at the high school that I mentioned earlier. My high school had an environmental studies program, and it was a very special program with 4 field trips a year, orienteering, whitewater canoeing, winter survival, and rock climbing. So if you went on all the trips, you could be gone from school for an entire month in the bush. And if you did well in the course, you could return as a student instructor. So I did. I went to every single trip for 3 years running, and I think I lived off the oxygen of those trips in between them, and just fell in love with nature. I was like a lot of teenage kids. I was quite awkward and insecure, and out in nature, what I looked like and whether or not I belonged, all of that fell away. And I just became another animal on the planet. And I found that extraordinarily reassuring. So I think I've been chasing that feeling ever since. It's what led me to tree planting, and also what brought me out to BC, and probably what led me to Cortez Island too. During the pandemic, I fell in love with Cortez. My husband and I did about 8 or 9 years ago, and then during the pandemic, we recklessly bought a couple of acres of raw land and started building. We created a driveway and started building a cabin out of the trees that had come down to make the driveway, which has been an incredible learning experience. But I needed to learn about the force of gravity, apparently, because I was supposed to be here in October and I fell off the build and broke a bunch of bones, so that's why I wasn't here. So all of that happened, that love for nature and being in nature happened before I got it together, sort of, to start writing. Yeah.
I think that love of nature is kind of really evident. Anyone who follows you on socials, almost every single photo has been taken outside. So I guess it was a happy accident that high school class evasion turned into this wonderful fascination and appreciation for the natural world, which makes its way into this book, which I'll get to a little bit later on. I wanted to ask you, before we move on to the book itself, do I have it right that you are building this off-grid home by yourself?
You have that absolutely correct. My husband is more confident about this, even though it's been 35 years since he's been around any kind of build than I am. But yes, all I can say is it was one of those pandemic things where we had a lot of time and too much time to think and not enough and dream. And yes, he designed it and we're building it ourselves.
So I'm guessing all the writing happens in the winter and all the building happens in the summer?
That's correct. And you live in Powell River, is that correct?
I do. So coincidentally, Katie and I, once you make the move, will be sort of across the water from each other.
So you know how crazy it is to build a house out there. That's what it's just really wild and remote, and it takes 3 ferries to get to Cortez Island. It's really it's a big endeavor. Yeah.
Well, it's a stunningly beautiful place, and I look forward to your Instagram photos once you make the move. I want to ask you a little bit about what happens to you in the wintertime when you're sort of in the thick of the creative process. I've read somewhere that this book had a long gestation period, and I know that seems a little bit sort of arbitrary when taken from the point of view of a writer, because I think all books have long gestation periods. I know that mine are certainly long, and I don't particularly like writing myself, but I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit of a taste of what your creative process is like.
Well, as I say, it took me a long time to come around to writing. It was a decade ago, over a decade ago, when I had sort of a midlife, and after teaching music for many years and raising my children, came back to writing. And my creative process, I write in the mornings when I can. I teach music. That's my actual job. So in my mornings are free, and that's a good thing. I get up extraordinarily early and write. This particular book began with colony collapse disorder, which had burst into the headlines in about 2007 in Europe, and it was around 2012 when I started writing. And at that time, there were a lot of headlines in North American papers, and I was particularly, I had an unexamined, bizarre hobby, and that was visiting apiaries. I would go and visit people's bee yards and their hives. And I would buy honey at a farmer's market and then get talking to the beekeeper. And if they extended an invitation to go and visit their hives, I would take them up on it. And that happened incredibly often. I think it's just a beekeeper thing. They would say, "Do you want to meet my bees?" And I'd say, "Yeah, that would be great." So I'd go and meet them. So I'd probably been to at least half a dozen bee yards before I started reading about bees all the time and writing. And I thought those two things might go together. I wanted to write about bees. And at that time, I thought about why it was that I had this bizarre hobby of going to visit bee yards. And I realized it was the first experience I ever had looking into a beehive. Had happened when I was 18 years old. With those same environmental studies kids, the ones who went on those out trips with me, we had decided to go to Lanark County, to Hopetown, where the book is set, to a family member's cottage. And the plan was we would take LSD and go for a walk in the woods. It seemed like a good plan because we weren't going to operate a motor vehicle. We would drink lots of water and just walk in the woods, and it was going to be very safe. And everything was going according to plan. We dropped it in the morning, and by noon it was really, really peaking, probably super high. And my friend said, "You know what we should do? We should go visit my beehives." And there were several of us, and nobody else took her up on it. But I said, "Yes, that sounds like a wonderful idea, good idea." I'd never seen inside one, but we suited up, and it could have gone spectacularly wrong. Traditionally, insects and acid are not a great combo. But she knew what she was doing, and we suited up, and she got her bee tool, and we headed out to her beehives. And she cracked the lid of that. Well, if you've been to beehives, or even if you've read about a bee yard, you'll know that it's not just a little sound as you get close to them. It's like it's more like the om of meditation or yoga. So I felt kind of welcome. I felt like, oh, this is fine. This is good. They're making a happy sound. And then my friend opened the top of the hive, and she removed the lid, and the bees rose up in this cloud. And important to note, these are European honeybees. They did seem kind of docile. They noted that we were there, and I almost felt that they could know, okay, I know I'm high here. I'm on but I felt like they knew we were there. And and that we had some kind of rapport, and then it was this magical experience where I got to see the frames, and my friend explained everything that was happening on them. And at one point, she had a single bee on her finger, and it flew off. And she said, "Katie, look where that bee's going. It's going off to those flowers. It's going to collect nectar and then bring it back to the hive." And I looked up, and I saw a golden line connecting the bee and the hive. And then I scanned the whole meadow, and there were golden lines everywhere. And yes, it was a hallucination. It was an awesome hallucination that it sort of seared itself into my neurons and stuck with me over all these years. So when I sat down to write a novel, finally, after 30 years, or from when I first wanted to write a novel, it was that moment that I thought of. And I thought I wanted to convey that feeling of looking inside a beehive. And the best way to do that was to have a character who had experienced being not an individual bee, because the bee isn't the individual. It's a superorganism. So you need the workers and the drone and the queen to create, to be the whole. So I wanted to have a person who had become the bee individual, which is the colony, and then reverted to human form, and so come back to tell about it. And that's where the novel began. It began with that moment, and everything else unfolded from there.
So it really does seem as if you were conducting research all those years ago without even realizing it.
I don't know. Research is kind.
So, I mean, you talk about bees quite a bit, and I'm going to come back to this a little bit later on, but is it really true that bees are responsible for pollinating 1/3 of our food? This is something that comes up in a scene that happens around about the 3/4 mark of the book. It's a big harvest dinner that is thrown on the farm. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I did a lot of research for the book. A third sounds low to me now. Bees and insects are responsible for pollinating a lot of our food. And without them, we're in big trouble. And that's why when colony collapse disorder is discussed, it seems almost quaint now, colony collapse disorder. In 2012, that's what scientists were almost panicked about pollination and food production. It was, we're not going to be able to eat because the bees aren't here. And now we've got climate change and biodiversity loss, and it seems sort of this avalanche. But 10 years ago, that was the big concern. And yes, without insects and without pollination, we're in big trouble.
Like I said, I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but I want to get into, before we get ahead of ourselves, I want to talk about the start of the book where we meet Melissa, who is the sort of the heart of the book, the second half of the book, along with Beck Wise. And at the start of the story, we meet her when she's been tasked with running the family farm, which is a really large operation with lots of workers and animals, while her mother has left the country and gone on a new age wellness retreat. And it's at this moment that Beck sort of wanders back onto the farm, very disoriented, not understanding what has happened to him for the last few months. He disappeared into thin air, much like her father had done more than a decade before. So you mentioned that this story is set in Lanark County, and I read this book kind of right around solstice. It was so dark and so rainy here on the West Coast. And I just felt like, what is this golden, idyllic world that these people live in? I mean, it's a modern world. There are cell phones and there's Wi-Fi, but it seems like a place almost out of time. How did this setting come to be? How did you build this world? Was it inspired by a real farm?
It wasn't inspired by a real farm, but it was inspired by Lanark County. So a lot of those, again, coming back to those environmental studies trips, the science teachers owned these properties in Lanark, and this is the 1980s, I guess permission slip was fine, and they would take us to properties around Lanark County. It's just beautiful around there, and I had all these idyllic memories of camping around there. So it's partly from memory, partly from Google. I didn't come back and go to my old stomping grounds and look at it. I went with my idyllic memories and then mapped those onto what actually exists around Hopetown and Lanark County. And then I drew my own nerdy little maps, which is a lot of fun. Once I had thought of the farmhouse, and I drew the inside of the farmhouse and the stairs, the entire house where Melissa lives. And then everything built from that. So Beck had to be a bicycle ride away from that farmhouse. So the cabin could only be a certain distance. And everything. Crescent Lake is a real lake, which was, I just imagined that the farm was that close to it. And roughly, Bow Lake is the lake that they swim in. And I almost spoiled there. But there are a couple of lakes bordering the property, so I guess it's partly imaginary and partly real. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about magic because it sort of springs up in all kinds of really interesting places in this novel. When Beck Wise is gone, he experiences a really profound metamorphosis. And he's unable to remember exactly what happened to him, but the way that he sees the world now, he's able to see the movements of bees through the environment. He has had the experience of being a bee colony. That's what exists in his memory. But this is not the first time that there's been a supernatural happenings in the story. He also experienced a kind of transformation as a young boy, and his mother, who's a secondary character, is a priestess of Santeria. Do you want to talk a little bit about magic and how you used it in the story?
Sure. So I thought that there were two ways that Beck could actually have become a bee colony, and I was torn myself what they were. One was scientific, and the other was spiritual. I read a lot of books about beekeepers and beekeeping, and I was struck by the fact that there were bee facts and bee lore. And the two were almost inextricable. Like if a really scientific book about beekeeping would still have the superstitions about telling the bees. And it's like they couldn't resist. The bee lore was attached to the bee science. So I gave Beck one scientific parent, his father, Matthew, who's logical and practical. And when his son comes to him and says, I was a beehive, he says, well, I'm going to take you to the doctor. Like, we need to get you checked out. And he's very methodical. And opposite that methodical father is his mother, Eurydice, and she's faith-based entirely. She's a really spiritual person. In fact, she's Santera. She's a priestess of Santeria. And when Beck tells her that he had become a bee colony, she just accepts it absolutely fully, and she's happy that he's back, but she's like, well, I guess you have that experience now of being a bee colony. It was difficult. I knew I wanted a spiritual person to be Beck's mother, and there was a reason I thought that he might have been able to have become a bee colony, which was a spiritual reason. But the religion itself, I went down I guess probably a writer's research wormhole of Santeria. I got interested, and then I started reading everything I could about it, and then I started watching videos, and then I went to Cuba, and I went to Trinidad, and I went to a Santeria temple and visited a Santero, and I actually wrote a lot more about Santeria. Thank goodness for editors is all I can say.
So during the editing process, you trimmed back some of that material?
It was great background, but it wasn't pertinent to the center of the story. Eurydice really, I mean, all my characters really came to life for me. Eurydice's passion for her faith and the fact that she believes in the transmigration of souls and all of that was really important. And those experiences that Beck had, the scientific and the spiritual, it strikes me that we have a very science-based world. Since maybe the scientific revolution, all our answers for everything are science-based. And I believe in science. I do. But if you approach a problem only from a scientific standpoint, I think maybe we're leaving something out, something more spiritual. So, for example, climate change. We've had the data and we've known about what was going to happen to the planet for a very long time, and yet we haven't done anything about it. And there's been this extraordinarily data-based science approach to educating the population about it. And it's so the head has been there, but where's the heart in that? Does it really matter what the science is if the result is going to be that people are in pain and losing their homes, and and not just people, animals. So yeah, it seemed like I wanted readers to balance the scientific and the spiritual in their wondering how Beck had become bees. I wanted them to think, well, maybe it was something to do with quantum physics, and maybe it was something to do with the transmigration of souls. Maybe he had actually somehow had some kind of out-of-body experience and become a bee colony. And if those were balanced roughly 50-50, I was going to be really happy.
Well, you do a really amazing job with Eurydice's character because she has all kinds of powers, and they're written about so convincingly that as a reader, I feel that she could heal me if I had a terrible disease. She represents this spiritual side of the story for you, but also served a really interesting sort of plot function in the sense that, we're halfway through and we really do have no idea what happened to Beck. And Melissa Makepeace is sort of a detective trying to get to the bottom of what happened to her boyfriend while he was missing, since he has absolutely no memory of the prior 3 months. And in this sense, the story almost from the very beginning is a mystery. And we've mentioned the word spoiler a couple of times, and I'm going to try really hard not to reveal anything inadvertent. But Melissa spends a good part of the story, number one, trying to find out what happened to her boyfriend, going down various avenues that produce some insight and then some that don't. And she's also at the same time trying to discover what happened to her father, Charlie, who disappeared 12 years before without a trace, kind of leaving everybody to wonder what had happened to him, most of all Melissa, who was just a young girl at the time. Do you want to talk about how you conceptualized this mystery when you started writing, and how you balanced all these threads and expertly weave them together in such a way that we're left guessing about what's happening until almost the very end?
Sure. Well, I had a lot of editorial help, but originally when I wrote the manuscript, I had decided between the scientific and the spiritual, and there was one ending. Melissa Makepeace had to be a certain kind of person in order to receive Beck. She had to be someone who had experienced loss in a big way, and also someone kind of headstrong and a beekeeper. And I should talk a little bit about Melissa in terms of that. It seemed to me colony collapse disorder was a very specific kind of disappearance. Like other bee diseases, when you look into the hive, for like varroa mites, the bees will be disfigured, or with American foul brood, the frames will be all dissolved. But with colony collapse disorder, the bees are just gone. They're there 1 minute or that one season, and when the beekeeper comes back, they're just gone. And it seemed to me that the human equivalent of that was ghosting, when someone you love and that you care about very much just leaves without a note, without an explanation, leaving you to wonder, was it me? Was it something I said? Was it something I did? And so that had happened to Melissa with her father when she was 11 years old. She came downstairs for breakfast one day, and her mother said, "Your dad's gone. He's not coming back. You need to get on with your life." And of course she couldn't. She developed these physical tics that plagued her for several years in her childhood. And when we meet her at the beginning of the book, she's gotten on with her life, and she's gotten rid of those tics. But that when Beck comes back, not when he leaves, but when he comes back, so do her tics. And that's what prompts her to reopen this investigation of her father. She'd almost accepted the fact that he had gone and he wasn't coming back, and maybe he was just a deadbeat dad, or she didn't know. She had fantasies about where he was. But then she decides that she's going to look for him again. And the end of that mystery, I knew how that was going to play out from the moment I thought of it. I just knew that one was totally wrapped up. It was the Beck mystery that I didn't know. And so I tried to, I'm not sure if this is a good idea. It probably isn't, because it took me so long to write this book, but I tried to write my way out of it. To begin at that point of him being bees, to have these two ideas, and to discover myself what had happened to Beck while I was writing the book. In practice, what happened was the book at one point in 2018, it wound up at a larger publishing house, and a couple of excellent editors got their hands on the manuscript. And they wrote me an editorial letter that was brilliant. It was just unbelievable. So they had the book for almost a year. And then when they came back with this editorial letter that said, we're interested, but you need to revise the book, they asked this question, and it was a key question, and I can't tell you what it was because it would be a spoiler question, but it was where was the certain character at a certain time? And it was like a thunderbolt, and I realized, no, it's not a duality, this book. There's a third possibility of where Beck could have been and how he changed into bees. And I just knew that possibility had to be there. And once I realized the possibility had to be there, everything fell into place. It was like a jigsaw puzzle that you suddenly find all the pieces to. I went, oh my gosh, everything fits perfectly, but now that means I have to revise this manuscript, and revising it's going to take a really long time. Anyway, I had no choice. So I went back to the drawing board. And my favorite kinds of stories are the stories that have that aha moment where the writer's been fooling you all the way along. And then you get, when it's revealed, it's not just that the writer's thought of something, but they knew all the way along and they've been hinting and teasing you the whole, I love that in a book. So I thought, okay, I have the opportunity to do that, but now I have to go back and revise this whole manuscript, which I did. And that took the better part of a year. And then I sent it back to these editors, and they said, it's great, we really like your revision, but regrettably, it's not right for our list. So I was crushed in a way, but I was also really excited because it was a much better book because of that editorial letter. So I knew I had a much better book than I'd had before. One of those editors said, when she was saying, I'm sorry, we're not going to take it, she said, I must have complained about the publishing industry moving slowly because she said, publishing is a slow-turning wheel, but sometimes the slow-turning wheel is a useful thing. And by that time, it had been so many years already, and I had been so much invested in this book that I actually printed off the slow-turning wheel is a useful thing in large letters and taped it on my computer to remind myself not to be impatient.
Thank you for sharing that story. Sometimes I feel like many of us have these sort of very lengthy experiences, and we often don't talk about them publicly because it's sort of all enmeshed with our creative processes. When you mention mystery, I feel as if all readers, well, I'm just going to speak for myself. I also love it when the writer presents a third thing that I sort of knew was always going to be there, but then I'm shocked and delighted by it in the very last parts of the book. And I think that is one of the great delights of reading stories with a lot of suspense and drama. I don't want to push too far into that because I know I'm probably going to spit something out I shouldn't and spoil the last third of the book. But I did want to mention that, there's a lot of very heartfelt, very strong, palpable emotions that Melissa Makepeace feels because she has experienced all this loss. And we were introduced to it when her boyfriend returns because she really is in a stew of emotion about, the return of this man that she loves and yet has not been able to say that she loves him. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. But I want to ask you before we get too far into the hour. Katie, what is Mad Honey?
Okay, Mad Honey is a real substance. It's delibal is the Turkish term for it. Bees, the chemical composition of honey depends on what bees are feeding on. So whatever flowers they go to, as they process it, the chemical composition of honey changes. And delibal is a real substance. There was recently a viral video of a bear in Turkey that had ingested some of it, and if you haven't Googled this, you probably should. The bear is clearly, and we're here again, really high on this honey. So that is it's a real substance. Yeah.
That was a really fascinating part of the story, and it's really clear to anybody who gets even a chapter or two into this book that you really did do so much research on bees and just the incredible intricacy and beauty of their collective world and how they perceive their universe on planes that we can't even detect. You describe the way they communicate with each other, and they even have a form of math, I'm going to put that in quotes, that you describe during a scene that's set on the U of T campus. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So thanks for asking about that. Of everything I read about bees, probably the most fascinating thing was one Discover magazine article from 1998 written by Adam Frank about a mathematician named Barbara Shipman, who she was a physicist too, and she worked at the University of Rochester, not far from here. And the article was called Quantum Honeybee, and it described what Barbara Shipman was actually studying. And I actually made it into a scene in the book. Would you mind if I just read that scene? It's easier.
Yes, that would be lovely.
So I sort of honored Barbara Shipman and put the quantum physics that were possible that might be an explanation behind Beck's transformation into the book with this character, Barbara Beauchemin, who's a physicist who works out of Trinity College. So Beck's father takes him down to visit Dr. Beauchemin at Innis College. And I basically write the theory that Barbara Shipman actually... Sorry, I'm trying to find the page here. Oh, here it is. So we have Beck and his father, Matthew, who's very practical, and Dr. Beauchemin, and they're in Trinity College. Oh. And this is the little professor scuttled over to him. Her complexion was whitish gray, as was her straight, shoulder-length hair. Her hand, when Beck shook it, was limp and clammy. They introduced themselves. He is Beck, she is Professor Beauchemin, and she hastened back behind her desk. Father and son settled into black leather-upholstered chairs across from her. "It's so good to see you again, Matthew, and lovely to meet you, Beck. Time seems to roll along without mercy these days. I'm working on a documentary film, and it consumes a good deal of my stamina. How are things for you?" Matthew launched into a description of life on the Organoponigo. The professor listened eagerly and asked questions. Beck tried to focus on the conversation, but outside, the sun was slanting over the rooftops into the quadrangle, illuminating flowers and neatly mown grass clumped up around clover. To his amazement, Beck's eyes picked up the golden vectors of bee travel, and then he saw the bees, each individual as bright as a firefly. He gaped out the window in wonder. Enough about me. Matthew's ears were flushed, and he rubbed his sideburns self-consciously. "What's your documentary about?" "It's an examination of the plight of the honeybee," said Professor Beauchemin. "Ah, bees. Fascinating creatures," said Matthew. Bee vectors converged on the southwest corner of the quadrangle. Could there be a hive nearby? Beck imagined he could hear the buzzing, and then he could hear it. A single worker picked her way through clover and arrived at a flower, hairy abdomen, rubbing powdery pollen, bent black legs loaded with orange globs of nectar. "You're a beekeeper? But how wonderful!" Professor Beauchemin was addressing Beck. Flexing all the willpower he could summon, he ripped his focus from the bee. "Are you interested in the navigational capabilities of the honeybee, Beck, on a quantum level?" Beck stared at Barbara Beauchemin for a long moment, astonished by her ability to climb inside his thoughts. The humming of bees blended with the sounds of traffic whizzing by and distant student voices. "I don't understand what you mean by quantum level. I think it's super cool that bees use the angle of the sun to find nectar loads," he said. "Let me share with you an interesting theory. It was dismissed as rubbish years ago, but it is the crucible in which I conceived my current project. Over a decade ago, an American mathematician was playing with two-dimensional representations of a flag manifold." "Sorry, a what?" Matthew asked, setting his chin on a fist. "A flag manifold. It's a six-dimensional field that mathematicians use for making hypothetical calculations." The professor turned abruptly to her desk, yanked a drawer open, located a scrap of paper and a sharp pencil, and started drawing. Mathematicians, always postulating. Barbara Beauchemin waved a miniature white hand in the air. "We don't have to jump down that rabbit hole. It isn't as impenetrable as it sounds. I can draw this." She quickly drew a perfect circle. "And tell you to see a sphere. It's a two-dimensional representation of a ball, which is a three-dimensional object. You see?" Beck nodded. Matthew frowned. "A flag manifold, a six-dimensional field, looks like this on paper." She drew a hexagon. Beck spasmed at the sight of it, and she smiled.
Yes, it's a honeycomb cell. Not surprising, of course, 6 sides of equal length. But the thing is, this mathematician plotted the way quarks would behave in this field. Quarks, do you know what they are? Tiny subatomic particles. And these are the shapes that emerged over and over again. The scratch of a pencil, briefly. Oh, the dances, Beck exclaimed. His father raised his eyebrows. Precisely. The professor beamed at Beck. Right answer, gold star. The mathematician who conducted this experiment didn't delve any further, as far as I know. She was roundly ridiculed for this research, by the way. The scientific community reacted very harshly, but I saw the appeal of her idea. It has a lovely poetic symmetry, doesn't it? Honeycomb shapes, waggle dance shapes. It points to honeybees having some perception in a quantum dimension, a perception we humans lack, or perhaps cannot yet perceive.
Beautiful. Thank you. The way you write about bees, I think they should be running our world. I want to ask you about time and how it comes to play in the story. You know, in many ways, I thought when I had closed the book, it stayed with me for quite a while. And I kept thinking about how these are two people in love that are kind of struggling to find each other, even though there shouldn't be any impediments to them being together. They're so young and really at the start of their adult lives. And yet they seem to be always kind of caught up, tripped up by the past. There's more than one intergenerational betrayal in this story. And I'll leave it up to you to decide how much you want to talk about that. But how do you think about how you layered in how the past comes to bear in the present in the story with particular regard to your two main characters?
My protagonists are in their 20s, and I have 2 daughters in their 20s, so I am in the enviable position of being able to observe a lot. I'm close with my daughters, and I've watched them and listened to them with their friends, and so that particular generation, I think all generations have some contempt for the older generation, but in our case in particular, we are handing that generation the biggest betrayal possible, I think. And I think I feel like I deserve their contempt sometimes. I'll speak for myself, but I wanted to include that in how those characters are. I mean, they're not settled. They're not as settled as I was at that age. I feel like I was a bit oblivious in my 20s. That's an understatement. I was much more Pollyanna about my future, and I felt like nature would always be there for me. And my children are definitely different. And so I was trying to capture that, and I don't think I'm hipper than other people my age. I just think I was really trying to. Beck and Melissa and Daphne are all of this certain age, and I was trying to capture. A good example is Beck is going to the doctor's, and his dad says to him, "Let's drive." And they live in Lanark County, and they're going to drive to Toronto. And there's a bus that goes right near their place, and it goes to downtown Toronto, and all the medical professionals they're going to see are in downtown Toronto. And Beck is really frustrated with his father. He just says, why would we take our vehicle? Like, that's just going to be annoying downtown, and I think we should take the bus. And what I hope was conveyed there, and what comes up in other places in the book, is a bit of contempt and loss of respect for the older generation. Not just in the fact that he wouldn't take his car, but that he wanted to take his car and he should have taken public transportation, but a more general loss of trust and respect. So a larger generational divide, I guess, is what seemed accurate to me.
Yeah, I feel like the 3 of those characters, you mentioned Daphne as well, who is Melissa's adopted sister. The 3 of those characters really have to accept a lot of weight from their parents' generation and beyond. And really they emerge at a place that's sort of tentatively optimistic at the end, if I can put it that way. I wanted to come back to your treatment of the natural world, because I feel like it's really on every single page. The way that you think about bees, the way that you treat the beauty of the natural world. Do you think that fiction can be a form of activism?
I think when I started writing fiction, I really thought that I could bludgeon my beliefs into my readers, and that was a mistake. The essay is a great form of trying to convince somebody of something, but fiction isn't going to convince you of anything. Fiction is going to make you feel. So if it's a form of activism, I think it's a subtle one, much subtler than other writing forms. But it still could be, it's very indirectly, I guess I would say it could be a form of activism. Rebecca Solnit recently wrote, "Every crisis is a storytelling crisis." And she quotes a poet, Adrienne Marie Brown, as saying, "We're in an imagination battle." So if we can't imagine a future other than, and I don't mean just science fiction writing, like can we imagine a future that without cars, or can we imagine a future less technologically or oil dependent, I guess. I mean it in a subtler way than that. A future where we're different with each other. A future where we treat each other differently. Maybe where where we're not as trusting. Maybe, I mean, that same Melissa, Daphne Beck generation are pulling down statues, and it's good, and they're asking questions. When I went to school, I read the textbooks, and they were, it was sort of the word from on high, and you read the book, and you memorized the book, and then you spat the book back out. And I think it's great that young people are questioning all of that right now. So if a little tiny bit of that can come through fiction, if the characters seem a little bit different than maybe we expect them to be, then if that's activism, then I guess it can be.
I admit to asking that question for selfish reasons. I completely agree that I think there's a difference between knowing something and feeling something. And you certainly did make me feel a great deal of love and affection for Mother Nature. Katie, you've been so generous with your readings and your answers tonight. Shall we take some questions from the audience?
Sure, that sounds great. Thank you. Yes? Sorry, can I ask you to hold on just for a second? Can you ask your question into the microphone, actually?
Neapolitan microphone. Over 30 years ago, the Canadian military developed a bee institution where they use bees to go out into the meadows, the corny meadows, and they would go to certain different areas, different sections, and they would come back and they would determine, using the bees, where there were mines. And so the bees got an A+ for, for mankind. War is an approach to world order that is eternal. Friction and fiction. You talked about brilliant ballistics. There was mascara in your voice. Bereavement's privilege, an apology of thankfulness. What instigated you to come up with these successful themes and using the axiom of the enigma of love, I benevolent you? What was your major catalyst in coming up with happy endings? And your major work now, is it similar to what you have written in the past?
Well, I'm not going to spoil my book by saying it has a happy ending or not, first of all. when I wrote about the bees, if I understand your question correctly, bees are a society like we're a society, and if we see ourselves in them, or if the military is trying to use them, or what, any similarity that we see is, they're endlessly fascinating because they are a society. They're an incredible animal. I couldn't have written this book and said, well, Beck turned into like a pod of porpoises, although I guess that would be a water problem. But he couldn't have turned into anything else other than bees, because they are such a complex societal creature. That's what made it more surprising. I mean, if he turned into a more individual animal, then it might have been less surprising, and I think that's been done. But the fact that he turned into a bee colony was speaks to the endless fascination of bees. Anyway, are there any other questions?
Katie, would you ever get tired of honey, and would you keep bees on your new property?
Two excellent questions. Thank you, and thank you for coming tonight. I could never get tired of honey. I'm endless. It's like wine, and I'm actually, I don't drink. I'm sober for 11 years, so I'm a connoisseur of the bouquets of honey, I guess. It really is incredible how different it can be. So no, I don't think I'll ever get tired of honey. And I haven't tried Delhi Ball. Nobody's asked me. I haven't yet, but I would not stop. If somebody had a jar full of it, I would definitely try it. When it comes to keeping bees on Cortez, that's an interesting question, because when we got a rural piece of land, I wanted to jump on it. I've always wanted to keep bees, and I've visited so many hives, and I thought this is the perfect opportunity. And then I met other beekeepers on Cortez Island, and it turns out that wild bees also need to be supported. And honeybees aren't the greatest support, actually. To put a competitor into the wild bee into their environment is actually not a great thing to do. So beekeepers on Cortez Island are much more focused on wild bees, and that's another part of the very steep learning curve I'm having on Cortez Island, is that bee health is an entirely different thing than I thought it was. Thanks.
Have we seen the last of bees in your fiction? You seem to have a very deep connection to them, so I'd imagine this is something you're going to want to explore in a different way.
That's a really good question. Thank you. I think for now, but not the last of animals, because a very frustrating thing for me is I know we're in the Anthropocene, but I feel like animals don't have a voice. And they definitely, of course, they're not going to have a voice in our fiction. They're not writers or readers, but they're not considered enough as being fellow creatures on the planet that we need to, we have these giant brains. So don't we owe it to the animals to use them to not create a catastrophe and wreck everybody's living environment. So I'm constantly thinking about animals and how I have a lot of talking animals in my fiction, is what I'm trying to say. And those aren't going away anytime soon.
Thank you very much for your talk and the reading. I really like the topic of bees and honey and so on, and something sweetness about it and healthy. And I was wondering if you could make a connection, if there is one, just given our economic times and just this idea of sort of economic crisis that we're having globally, and the whole idea of money. And I just wondered if there's a analogy connection between mad honey and mad money.
That's a good question. I don't think there is. That's kind of opened up a bit of a can of worms, because that word "mad" is, in the sense of mad honey, it means crazy. It's the British sense of it. And mad money, I believe, is when you're absolutely furious and you need to get home. So, I mean, that word "mad" is flexible like that. But any economy. It's interesting that you should bring up the economy, because money's gotten us to this point where, the currency, the fact that we're absolutely focused on that as a goal, takes us away from what's important, I think. And what's important is what's important to bees. And Beck's kind of in that world when he comes back from being bees. He doesn't get it. He's sort of stunned that people live in this world where they have to sell things and make things and do things. Why aren't people just more connected to nature and connected to the land? He's stymied by the fact that people are acting in this very bizarre fashion. For the harvest banquet in my book, for example, they have to raise money because some hives have been damaged. And he just doesn't get it. He's still half in that bee world. He's still half in that nature world. And that's something else we have to consider, is that we're just one species of, thousands, and the rest of them don't care about money. So, yeah. Yes?
I was just wondering if you're aware that we do have a live beehive at the Royal Ontario Museum, the ROM, just down the road. And I'm a volunteer there, and we talk to the visitors about the habits of bees. And most of them are fascinated with what we were able to tell them and describe the waggle dance, as you mentioned. So it's a good way of getting the younger people and adults interested, and some men will examine the hive and think, well, that would be something nice for me to have at home, and so it creates a lot of interest.
Well, thank you very much. I did not know that there was a hive at the Royal Ontario Museum. That's wonderful. At that very special high school that I went to, there was a hive on the roof. And the environmental studies program that I was involved in, the two teachers actually extracted and sold the honey to pay for equipment for the environmental studies program. So I never actually, my first time was the time with the acid on the farm, but those bees were there on the roof, and they're not as scary. Mind you, I did help a person in San Miguel de Allende take care of a hive once. And as we got close to it, the bees were making a more aggressive sound, like I didn't feel safe. And we were completely sewed up. But when he opened it, the beekeeper said, we can only be in here for about a minute, and then we need to get out really quickly. And I thought he was being extravagantly careful. And as he was taking off the top, he said, you do realize these are semi-Africanized. They were killer bees. And they were completely different than European bees. I think I mentioned the fact that this docile feeling I had around bees, it was excellent for the more aggressive scenes in Mad Honey, that I had this experience of taking the top off the hive. I don't know, you probably have European honeybees. Yeah. These ones, we took the top off, and it was like a hailstorm of bees hitting the veil. And when we went away from there, about 45 minutes later, a kilometer away, bees were still coming and circling us. So, bees are not all Apis mellifera, the European honeybee. But you can still get honey from semi-Africanized bees. You just have to be a little braver.
I just wanted to ask you about fiction and about the choice to write fiction. I mean, I totally understand, that Beck becoming bees kind of necessitates fiction. But I was interested in something you said about how you came to know your characters so much. And I guess I just wanted to ask you, as someone who had wanted to write for so long and hadn't, how did you come to write a novel? How did you choose fiction?
That's a great question. I did always want to write fiction. When I was here, I wanted to write fiction. I took my degrees in English, but I hadn't taken a stab at it while I was here. I was busy writing papers. I thought I would graduate from university and begin writing fiction. And so I was in my early 20s, and it turned out that, and I tried to write a novel, and it turned out that writing a novel was a lot trickier than I had thought. And I was so disappointed in the result, in what I produced, that I pulled away from it for a long time. And life circumstances, took me away from having the time. It takes such a massive amount of time. I don't know for everybody, but for me it did. So it wasn't until my kids were grown that I really even had the opportunity again. And at that time, it all came back. I wanted to write fiction again. And it was like a drive, which I think it has to be, because it is it has unremitting demands. Yes?
What other sorts of fiction do you anticipate exploring in future?
I'm working on a book about the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake that we're expecting in British Columbia. It's somebody just wrote one about that, actually, but mine is a different take on it. It begins before the earthquake, and then the earthquake happens during the course of the novel, and it's post-apocalyptic after that. And I was talking to Evelyn earlier about highways. I was in the middle of writing a post-earthquake scene about the highways being destroyed when the highways in BC actually were destroyed by flooding in November of 2021. So I was, again, both crushed and excited because the highways being destroyed was so much like I thought it would be. I thought the over-deforested hills would probably flood, and the flooding would cause the highways to crack, and that's exactly what happened, and we got completely cut off in Kamloops. So, yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. Yes?
Just doubling back on the question I asked her before, I was just wondering if you could, the whole idea of sustainability, and I just wondered if you feel compelled to write about sustainability, because you could clearly have gone that direction a little bit if you want, like with this topic of nature and other sentient beings and animals, and I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, sustainability.
Well, indirectly, I think we talked about fiction being, as a form of activism, it has to be indirect. Otherwise, it's just annoying for people to read. But in the post-earthquake world that I'm writing about right now, sustainability is a factor. And I think we're all thinking about sustainability more because of climate change and the increased amount of storms and disasters that we're seeing. How much security do we actually have? A decade ago, I don't think people could have told me how much food security they have. And now it seems like if I ask someone how much food security they have, they can go, oh yeah, 2 days, 3 days. They know how long it's going to be until the grocery stores, the trucks don't come to the grocery stores, and then they're dependent on whatever it is they have. I'm not advocating for prepper behavior right now, but I think communities are great, and one of the appeals of Cortez Island is that they are thinking about sustainability. The community there has a food sustainability. They have a plan. They even have a plan to grow chestnut trees because you can make flour from chestnuts, and they, wondering how they're going to get flour. I mean, I think it's incredible that there's people who are thinking about this in a calm, can-do kind of way. I think those are maybe the conversations that we need to be having, sustainability, but not in a panicked kind of, oh my gosh, what are we going to do without oil way, which is the way we're having sustainability discussions right now. It always seems to come back to private car culture, which really is beside the point. I mean, we need clean water and we need food, and we need each other. More than anything, I think we need each other. The communities where people take care of each other are the ones that are going to be the most sustainable inherently. The ones where people are all after each other are the ones that are going to fall apart. So, if I can reflect that in my fiction, I think about it all the time. But if it comes out in my fiction, great, and I'll try to do it as subtly as possible, so you don't know what's happening until until you're reading it.
I've had many brilliant ideas and concepts over the past decade, and some of them are like, making Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola ginger ale into a beer, or going out into the farm and making hay out of beer, a very big resource in Canada and in the global market, and also making Guinness into a soft drink or pop. I haven't drank, I've been an abstainer for 7 years, and also making algae and lily pads into a food source. Maybe it would revolutionize the cooking oil industry for all the chefs out there. And then another one is to make coffee or cafe into a beer. What was your great discovery, accelerated discovery that has graced the marketplace?
I don't have one, but I think those sound wonderful, and I'm afraid that we're probably out of time, which is sort of a Saved by the Bell sort of situation.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight. Thank you, Charlotte and Katie, for such a candid and fascinating conversation. And I just want to remind you that there will be more events coming up. So on February 22nd, there'll be a screening of Black Ice, followed by a panel discussion with filmmaker Hubert Davis. And we also have the release date of Charlotte Gill's memoir, Almost Brown, which is currently available for pre-order, and it's going to be released on June 6th, 2023. So make sure to book a copy of that for yourself. And hopefully we'll have an event here, Charlotte. We'll have to talk about that. That would be great. And then I also wanted to remind you that there is a table available in the lobby for Katie to sign books after the event. So you can find her there. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Katie.